to this special Fulbright 75th anniversary event, John Hope Franklin, Redefining the American Story. My name is Madeline Welch. I work on the Fulbright events team at the Institute of International Education. And as you may well know, 2021 marks the 75th anniversary of the Fulbright program, and we'll be putting on lots of special events throughout the year, highlighting our program's most accomplished alumni, such as Dr. John Hope Franklin. So I want to turn things over to Mary Kirk, who's going to welcome us and kick off our event.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Kirk. I'm the director of the Office of Academic Exchange Programs at the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs of the U.S. Department of State. We at the Bureau are thrilled to host this evening's event as we honor the impressive legacy of Dr. John Hope Franklin, one of the most prominent alumni of the Fulbright program and the former chair of the Fulbright Scholarship Board. The Fulbright program, the flagship international exchange program sponsored by the US government, has fostered mutual understanding between the United States and other countries since 1946. Funding for the program is provided by the United States Congress through an annual appropriation, and also by partner governments, by the private sector, including individual donors, and institutions of higher education. Several American nonprofit organizations administer components of the program on behalf of the US Department of State, and these include the Institute of International Education, and we thank IIE for organizing this panel today. 2021 is the 75th anniversary of the Fulbright program. We're exploring the life and work of Dr. John Hope Franklin as part of these anniversary celebrations and in honor of Black History Month. Dr. Franklin's son, noted historian John Whittington Franklin, will be leading this evening's discussion. Our moderator, Dr. Eaton, and our panelist, Dr. Frazier, are distinguished Fulbright alumni. Mr. Franklin, on behalf of the Fulbright program, I want to convey how proud we are of your father's legacy as a Fulbrighter. He was involved in the program for almost 70 years. As a Fulbright Scholar, he shared his academic research and his personal experience as an American in the UK, in Australia, in Venezuela, in Zimbabwe, and Brazil, and other countries. He served as a member and then as the chair of the presidentially appointed Fulbright Scholarship Board, steering program policies and overseeing the selection of award recipients. Dr. John Hope Franklin epitomized what we hope all Fulbrighters will become: impressive academic and personal accomplishments in them, but also coupled with the drive to contribute to the betterment of society. John Hope Franklin was a trailblazer. He graduated from Fisk University at the age of 20. He earned a doctorate from Harvard. He created the discipline of African American studies. He headed major college history departments. He led the Phi Beta Kappa organization. He advised the President's Commission on Race during the Clinton administration. He served as the founding chair of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture's Scholarly Advisory Committee, and he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Dr. Franklin was an American patriot, despite the fact that he grew up in segregated America. He believed deeply in the values of the United States. He was a champion of diversity and inclusion, and he led by example. He took on his work with purpose and pride, breaking down barriers, opening doors, and then holding those doors open with the goal of offering others opportunities to follow him. As a nation, we continue to struggle with racial justice and equality in our country. Dr. Franklin's life and work will inspire us to act as he would, thoughtfully, pragmatically, humanely, and with clarity, and to work individually and collectively towards a better country and a better world. So, Mr. Franklin, we look forward to your remarks, and we thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Mary, for your welcoming remarks. We really appreciate those. And now I want to introduce our panelists and our moderator for this evening's event, all of which bring a unique, important insight to the life of legacy of Dr. John Hope Franklin. So first, I would like to introduce John Whittington Franklin, historian and son of Dr. John Hope Franklin. For the past 50 years, Mr. Franklin has specialized in the history and culture of Africa and its diaspora, working with the Smithsonian Institution to expand understanding of its diverse cultures and histories in Washington, D.C. and around the world. In 2005, Franklin was part of the initial team involved in forming the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, which opened in Washington in 2016. Since his retirement from the Smithsonian in 2019, Mr. Franklin established Franklin Global LLC, which allows him to continue his work lecturing on cultural issues and consulting with educational institutions. Our next panelist involved in our discussion this evening is Dr. Nishani Frazier, a U.S. Fulbright Scholar to Norway in 2016 and current Associate Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Kansas. Prior to her position at the University of Kansas, Dr. Frazier held positions as Associate Professor of History at Miami University in Ohio, Assistant to the Director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Archives at the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change, and personal assistant to Dr. John Hope Franklin before and during his tenure as chair of President Bill Clinton's One America initiative. Dr. Frazier recently published a book titled Harambee City, the Congress of Racial Equity in Cleveland and the Rise of Black Power Populism. Lastly, our moderator for our event this evening is Dr. Kalenda Eaton, a U.S. Fulbright Scholar to Canada in 2016 and current Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Dr. Eaton's areas of research and teaching include 20th and 21st century Africana literatures, the Black American West, women's studies, and African American cultural history and theory. From 2017 to 2019, Dr. Eaton was the Steinbrucker Endowed Chair in Humanities at Arcadia University, where she founded the Humanities Research Lab. For over 10 years, Dr. Eaton has traveled with students across Africa and the Western Hemisphere and is active in developing education abroad programs. Thank you all again to our wonderful panelists and moderator for being with us this evening. And before we dive into our discussion, we want to play a short clip to provide more context for our audience about where we will start our conversation today about the life and work of Dr. John Hope Franklin.
When I was 6 years old, my father, feeling that Venezuela, the village in which I was born, was not viable and would not ever permit him to move to the status that he thought he should move as a lawyer, moved then to Tulsa, Oklahoma, a much larger city, bustling, hustling, growing, and which was very prosperous in the 20s. We were all ready to go and to have a new life. And that's when the race ride engulfed Tulsa, and the entire black section of Tulsa was first looted, then burned and bombed. And when we finally got to Tulsa in 1925, 4 years after the riot, you still saw scars of the riot everywhere. Churches were right above the basement. There was no finished church in that part of town. And the schools, except for Booker Washington High School, which I attended and from which I graduated some years later, Booker Washington High School was the only high school that was only school that was standing in the black community. And everyone, though, rolled up his sleeves and did what they could to recover. Those were discouraging events, some of which I understood at the time, and some of which I did not understand. My father was a greater optimist than I am, and he thought that I was too young to be so lacking in hope for the future. And I said, well, you're so romantic. You're just full of imagination, and you're soft. I called him all kinds of names like that. We had a wonderful time arguing these points. And I was more restrained because I I said, well, maybe some people will believe it. And some people will be changed by what I expose. I've been working in this area long enough to know that when you touch a question of race in the United States, you touch a raw nerve, and therefore it's going to be a problem. I was not daunted by that, although it was a daunting task. I was not discouraged, and I was not running away from it because it was going to be a difficult task. Tasks are difficult if they're worth doing.
Great. And with that, we will go ahead and start our panel discussion for this evening. So I'll let you all take it away.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Madeline. And thank you to Fulbright, the Department of State, and all others responsible for the invitation to honor the lasting legacy of Dr. John Hope Franklin. We remember Dr. Franklin as one who worked to enhance the Fulbright program and the world through his knowledge, leadership, and commitment to writing a full and complete American story. So our conversation tonight will range from Dr. Franklin's early years through his experiences as an educator, researcher, and Fulbright ambassador. Mr. Franklin, let's begin at the beginning. Can you tell us about how your family arrived in Oklahoma?
With pleasure. My great-grandfather, David Birney, was born in 1820 in Tennessee, slave to Chickasaw Indian, the Chickasaw Indian family, the Birneys. And when the United States Congress passes the American Indian Removal Act of 1830, he walks with his owner and his owner's family from Tennessee to Indian Territory. He becomes a Black cowboy, a Black rancher, has a spread of land and farms it, has cattle, and he frees himself prior to the Civil War and changes his name to David Franklin. He enlists in the Union Army and is in the Army for a little over a year and comes back as David Franklin. He marries Millie, and they have 10 children. And my grandfather, who you see here in this image on the right, is born in 1879. He's a very promising young man. He is sent off to Dawes Academy. And then, of course, this is segregation. This is 1896. He goes off to Roger Williams University in Nashville. He cannot attend the University of Oklahoma. Of course, he cannot attend that university until the 1960s. So in the 1890s, he goes to Nashville and he meets my grandmother-to-be, Molly Parker. And they study with a man named John Hope, for whom they will name their second son. They marry in 1903. And while they were in college, petroleum has been discovered in Oklahoma and natural gas. And the eastern half of the country of the state is particularly rich in petroleum and natural gas. And that land is occupied by many African Americans and Native people. So some of them become very wealthy with the exploitation of these newly discovered natural resources. He goes away to college, as I said, and in this period after his college years, he moves to different towns in eastern Oklahoma, to Springer and Ardmore, and he begins to apprentice with a group of Black attorneys in Ardmore, studies by correspondence, because you know the Brown cases of '54 included the desegregation of the University of Oklahoma Law School, so he can't go to the University of Oklahoma Law School. And he studies by correspondence with the school, Sprague School of Law in Detroit, sits for the bar exam in 1907 and scores the second highest score in the state, 1 month after Oklahoma statehood. And Oklahoma would like to consider itself the Southwest, but it's deep in the South, and the first law passed by the state legislature is to assure that the transportation systems in the state remain segregated. African Americans go off to World War I, and they return after having experienced somewhat of freedom to a segregated United States ruled by Woodrow Wilson. Do we want to go to the next question?
All right. I wasn't finished. I wasn't sure if you were finished. Yes, we're going to move forward.
Kalenda, do you mind if I just add a little bit in terms of some historical context?
Sure.
Just very quickly, I just wanted to note that in part, the circumstances of coming back from 1919 is a global experience for a number of African-American men, and that in this moment of people returning, part of the vitriol that we see expressed in the Tulsa race riots has to do with this assertion of Black manhood as a result of having the experience of gone to war, fought for democracy, and then returning home, finding that they did not have democracy at home.
Thank you. Well, I mean, that's a great segue into the next question I was going to ask, which actually was about Black internationalism. And so so you've spoken, Mr. Franklin, about how your family came to Oklahoma, about your grandfather. Those who know your father's life know that your grandfather was a prominent lawyer who defended the victims of the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921. Hence the photo that we have. We are here in Oklahoma. Those of us in Oklahoma, of course, are recognizing the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre later this spring. I think nationwide, we all are recognizing that centennial. And so while much is spoken about, various different aspects of those events, I want to pick back up on something that Dr. Frazier was saying and hear your perspective about the role that Black internationalism played in that community's response to the terrorism.
Certainly. Well, our African-American troops are divided into two sections in Europe. There is the group under American command, under white Southern officers who dig ditches, unload and load the ships, and dig the graves. Woodrow Wilson would not allow most African Americans to have guns in World War I, and those who have guns fight under the French flag and receive French medals. And Woodrow Wilson and his military officers tell the French not to fraternize with the African Americans, which the French ignore, and they treat them as human beings. And African American soldiers get the opportunity not only to meet French people, but people fighting for France from the French colonies in West Africa and in the Caribbean. So this is the first encounter of African Americans abroad with other African Americans who've been, in the case of the Caribbean, through slavery and segregation in France, and then under the colonial rule in West Africa. Many of them stay behind or return to Europe and lose themselves among the African American and white American expatriates, the writers, Richard Wright. By this time, William B. Du Bois is going to Paris. Carter G. Woodson goes regularly, the founder of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, my uncle Rayford Logan, and they attend the Pan-African Congress in 1921 in Europe. So they come back then in 1918 to a country that is disturbed that they've had this freedom. And the infamous summer of 1919, called the Red Summer, many of our African-American veterans are lynched in uniform. There are riots and massacres in 36 US cities, and America is so forgetful that I saw no commemorations last year, 2019, of the Red Summer. I know that there was one in Baltimore. So African Americans have this international experience, international consciousness, which expands over time. Now, some of these veterans are part of the situation in Tulsa when a Black man is arrested for allegedly attacking a white woman in an elevator. The white men are deputized and armed and have a confrontation at the jail where this young Black man has been housed. And unfortunately, a shot is fired, and that leads to a conflagration of the community being looted, as my father said, burned to the ground, bombed from the air, and totally obliterated in 2 days. Tomorrow will mark exactly 100 years that my grandfather moved from Rentersville, leaving his 2 youngest children and wife behind, and moved to Tulsa. So February 20th, tomorrow, 1921 is my grandfather's arrival in Tulsa.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about your father's early years in Rentersville. And I believe the next slide takes us there.
Yes.
Okay.
There he is as an 8-year-old in 1923 on the right with the glasses. They called him a spelling demon because apparently he won all the spelling contests in the county, in the region. He is studied with his mother, who is a teacher in Rentersville, and he learned to read and write very early. And then you see him on the right in the middle, graduating from Booker T. Washington High School in Tulsa. And he was top of his class, surprise. And he talks with some bitterness of being at the Mayo Hotel, where both the Black valedictorian and the white valedictorian from Central High School are in the same ballroom and being honored, but he never gets to meet his counterpart at the Central High School because of segregation. He then goes on to Fisk, where he meets my mother, and they both graduate in 35. My mother goes on to library school, and Dad goes off to Harvard. He had hoped to go back to help his father with his struggling law practice, but he's fallen in love with US history from his professor, Theodore Currier, professor from Maine, who prepares Dad for Harvard. And Dad goes to Harvard and encounters anti-Semitism for the first time. And because he's an African-American student at Harvard in 1935, of course, they said it's enough to admit you, we don't have to make you a gentleman. So he can't live on campus. He has to live in a colored rooming house in the colored section of Cambridge, and works at the club that Jack Kennedy's older brother, Joe, works in. And then he has to go off to do his research.
So would you say, just kind of thinking about his scholarship, his scholarly trajectory, moving through these various different spaces, but also his focus on Black American history, would you say that this impacted his international experience as well?
Well, as a serious student of the African American experience, he studies Africa and African civilizations, African societies, looks at all the places that Africans are taken from and taken to across the New World. Those of us who focus on this know that only 5% of the 12.5 million Africans brought across the Atlantic come to the United States. The majority go to Brazil, and 1 million each to Haiti, Cuba, and Jamaica. Indeed, and close to 6 million are taken to Brazil as opposed to 500,000 here. So he's very interested in the origins, the dynamism, the slave trade, the wealth accumulated both in Europe and in the United States of the slave trade. And he's demystifying the happy history of America, as he calls it, because he's looking at how central African Americans are and how central slavery is to the economics of the United States. And it's not just an aside in American history, it is central to the American story. And so researching it, he experiences the challenges of being an African American researcher in the 30s, when it is not expected that African American researchers will need the resources of the state archives in North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi. And so when he goes to each of these archives on a grant from the Julius Rosenwald Fund, he has to negotiate with the archivist to gain access to these allegedly public materials. And he writes extensively about that in his autobiography.
Dr. Frazier, what are your thoughts on this as we move to the next slide too?
Yeah, I definitely wanted to add a couple of things to what John Franklin has already noted. Dr. Franklin is operating in a space in which he is segregated from everything. And what's unique about his work is that he's not just doing African-American grades or kind of cursory review. He has precursor Black historians, right, to turn to people like J.A. Rogers, who've written in Crisis Magazine, Dr. Du Bois. But this is a first major text looking at the whole broader experience of African Americans from slavery, as the book says, to freedom. And so he's applying the techniques of a scholar, of a historian, and having to go into the archives to get this material out. And so he's very cognizant of talking about the Black experience through the lens of the historical profession, but also being very clear that the Black experience doesn't begin first in the United States. So from slavery to freedom first begins in Africa. It talks about African civilizations, African empires. So even from the study of the domestic African-American experience, he first puts it in global circumstance, talking about where it is that we come from, and also demystifying this notion that Africa is some wild place, some primitive place, some backwards place. And that's in part what is informing attitudes and stereotypes about African Americans in the United States. So he's not just having to deal with the presumptions about Blackness in the United States, he's also dealing with the presumptions of Blackness around the world coming from Africa. And so he's reworking that as he's telling the whole story of Black people in the United States.
Thank you, Nishani.
Thank you.
So following his graduate work and getting his PhD in 1941, he begins teaching at the schools where he's permitted to teach at that time. He teaches at Bennett, he teaches at St. Augustine's in Raleigh, at North Carolina Central, and at North Carolina Central, he writes From Slavery to Freedom between his 5 classes he's teaching. I don't know how he did that. And then in 1947, he moves with my mother, Aurelia Whittington Franklin, who you see in this gorgeous Scurlock photograph, to Washington, to Howard University. My mother's a librarian in the Prince George's County school system, and my dad is teaching at Howard. And From Slavery to Freedom comes out that fall, and he's boosted onto the national level. He's been asked to speak at the Southern Historical and American Historical Association. And the Southern meets, of course, in the South at white segregated hotels where he can't stay, but the organizers arrange for him to at least come in the building to present his paper and then leave. And it's shortly after this image that he begins to travel with my mother and is invited to speak at the Salzburg seminar, first in 51 and then in 58. So he's beginning to take this more complex notion of American history and the central role of African Americans abroad.
Wow, this is all amazing. And so I'm assuming, right, that Mr. Franklin, you must have benefited quite a bit from these travels and lectures. Can you tell us a little bit about those experiences?
Well, sure. In 59, I start traveling with my father because universities are beginning to look, white universities are beginning to look at what would a Black scholar be like at this university? How would he interface with the faculty, the staff, and the students? So I learned to walk at Cornell, talk at Wisconsin. I'm 5 in Berkeley, my rival, I moved to Stanford. 6 in 59, we're in Hawaii. And Dad then is invited to Australia, where he travels around the world, literally bringing lots of goodies back to me. And then he goes to Nigeria. He's invited to lecture in Ibadan and Ife in Nigeria in October of 1960. Preparing for this talk, I've gone not only through the family photographs, but I found all of my parents' passports from 1950 through the 1980s, including my father's diplomatic passport when he was chair of the Fulbright board. So most children are getting images of Africa through Tarzan. My father is bringing me images that he filmed, that he photographed in Nigeria. And then he's off to Zanzibar and Tanganyika in '63 and brings real African artifacts and images back. So I don't have the stereotypical images that most people have. Here on this next image, you see me getting ready to go abroad. I am 10 years, I have just turned 10, and we are boarding the Queen Mary. My father is, I don't know where my mother is. Maybe that's her in the background. My father has been invited to spend the year teaching at the university in Cambridge, and I go to a British boys' school, the Perth School for Boys, founded in 1615 as a feeder school to the Cambridge schools. And my father takes me and my mother to Morocco. And I've already started learning French in the New York public schools, and I have to use my French in Morocco with the other children. The only Black children I see are the descendants of the West African slaves that the Mauritanians and the Moroccans have brought to Morocco, and these children are tending the camels in the camel market. I only see one other Black child before I return to Brooklyn later that year, and that's the other Black child in the school with me. I was thinking about this morning, and the principal in my school taught the math department, the math class, and he was choosing between two white students. I'm 10. And he says, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. I said, no, he's not going there. And he did. So how do you complain about the principal? So I went to my parents and told them what the principal had said, but he's the principal, so he can't be fired. So this is my first exposure to racism internationally. But that's my first opportunity to travel abroad. I love it. We spend New Year's in Paris. We spend Easter in Italy. And then I'm off and running. So by the time I'm 14, I go and live in France for the summer. I go back when I'm 16, and I graduated 16 too. And then went off to Stanford, and my first summer I spent in Martinique studying with the authors Aimé Césaire and Edouard Glissant. So I've been thrust into this international world. I take to it like a duck to water. And I'm still traveling. Well, we're in COVID now, but I've been traveling ever since.
Wow, this is a fascinating life. I know we have another slide here coming up, and I want to know if you could speak a bit.
If we go back to the other slide.
Oh, go back, okay.
Other places, because the 60s is really key for Dad and the Board of Foreign Scholarships. After we returned from England, as a member of the Board of Foreign Scholarships, he traveled extensively in the Middle East. Remember, this 7-Day War is coming up in '67. But before that, he's in Syria, he's in Iraq, he's in Iran. I loved the candies from the Tehran Hilton. He used to go to Damascus. He goes to all these places that then became difficult for Americans to travel to after the 7-Day War. He starts traveling extensively to the places where they have American studies programs, Germany, India, and Japan. And he's in South Asia. He's in Southeast East Asia. And then he's taking this much more nuanced history of the United States to the Soviet Union, when it's still the Soviet Union, to China. He travels extensively in Europe when he is chair of the Fulbright board. And then he lectures all over South America, Central America, Australia, and New Zealand. By this point in the 70s, I have moved to Senegal. I finished at Stanford, and I've moved to Senegal. and my parents come and visit me, and it's the summer, school's out, I'm teaching adults, and they take me with them to the Congo, to Zaire, to Kenya. My father's working on the biography of George Washington Williams, the first African-American historian. And this person has gone not only to Europe in the 1870s, but has met Leopold and decides to make his own trip to the Congo to investigate the alleged atrocities. When he gets to the Congo, he writes an open letter to the US government saying the United States should break relations with Belgium and the King of Belgium because of what he discovered in the Congo. Dad goes, then we can go to the next slide. So he's deeply involved in the Board of Foreign Scholarships, in lecturing abroad, and by the 90s, by the 80s, he goes to UNESCO General Conference in Belgrade. The very opening slide that you saw of him lecturing at the University of Dakar. Here on the right, he's on his third or fourth trip lecturing in Brazil. He starts going to Brazil in the 70s, and he's fascinated with the complexity of race in Brazil. Brazilian Portuguese has 160 words to describe the range of color from black to white. So we think of the United States being a caste society. Brazil is certainly as well. And I hope Isabel Wilkerson begins to look at Brazil as a caste society as she has done with India and the United States. One of the most important ways to get this information into Indian international audiences is to have his books translated into foreign languages. They are first translated into German, then Japanese, then Chinese, and with assistance from USIS into French and in Portuguese. So State Department has a role in determining which of our American books will be translated to make them accessible to foreign audiences. We still have been unsuccessful in getting From Slavery to Freedom translated into Spanish. And my father's newest co-author is Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, the most recent chair of the history department at Harvard and the current president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. She has just published the 10th edition. The 9th edition she wrote with my father until he passed. And then now 10 years later, she's published the 10th edition of From Slavery to Freedom.
So Dr. Frazier, I'm just listening to Mr. Franklin talk about Dr. Franklin's, life and work and travels and the impact that he has had in this international arena. What are your thoughts as a Fulbright alumna, as his former personal assistant, as a scholar, about this legacy, about Dr. Franklin's legacy at this point, I guess, in 2021?
Right. Well, actually, before I get to 2021, I actually want to talk about what Dr. Franklin was doing during the 1960s and remind people that right about the time Dr. Franklin is traveling, this is the high point of civil rights activism and Black power. So when he is going abroad, he's not just having to grapple with the nice picture, right, that the United States would like to paint of itself, but the contradictions are now glaring before the whole of the world. And this is also in the context of colonial decolonization movements that have happened in Africa. So Dr. Franklin is, on the one hand, trying to sort of have the Fulbright rethink this educational presentation when it comes to the United States. And he's also working within the organization to help them with a more shared relationship between the country where they're based and then the American program, right, and the American curriculum. Part of it has to do with the ways in which both Peace Corps and Fulbright have acted as a diplomatic face of the United States. The problem, of course, is that as a diplomatic face of the United States, and that face being it's democracy and freedom, is that the experience of Black people in the United States raised really uncomfortable questions about the United States as a representation of democracy and freedom. And so what Dr. Franklin is doing, and I'm going to now sort of bring it to the front, but he does is set the stage for the rest of us, right? Especially around the time that I began to travel as a Fulbright Scholar, because this is at the moment that we're really beginning to see the force of Black Lives Matter and the issue of police brutality. Now, this is not new. Obviously, historians, Dr. Franklin included, have talked about the issue of police violence in the Black community. And actually, as he is serving as advisory chair for President Clinton's One America, one of the sections of President Clinton's One America is to deal with this whole question of police and community conflict. So as a Fulbright Scholar, I'm having to do a sort of similar job of stepping into this space and talking about the ways in which the United States hasn't quite met its representation of itself, right, as a democratic, freedom-loving space. And dealing with the fact that in a lot of ways, the United States still has trouble dealing with those circumstances, right? So it sort of shifted away from, we don't have the problem, to, but we're courageously attacking these problems. We're courageously addressing the issue of racial inequality. Right. Yes, and mostly no. And yes, in terms, not necessarily the state, but for people who are on the ground and pushing the state to kind of reckon with these issues. But One America comes out of this moment of the 1990s, which really appears to be coming from the top, administrative down, right, from President Clinton and the Clinton administration. But we have a whole sort of emergence of Black resistance. We see it in hip hop. This is around the time that we have the Million Man March. And so there is a rising tide even in the 1990s. And at the same time, this is the first Democratic Party-led government since really 1970s with Jimmy Carter. Right. And so these issues of race have been appearing in the 90s again and again and again. And so One America is an initiative by Bill Clinton to try to grapple with the sort of ways in which solving racial inequality continues to remain out of reach for the United States. So that's when I started to work with Dr. Franklin, is right about that moment. And actually it's in the corner, the report. The report is amazing in what it outlines in terms of the problems that need redress within the United States. And in a lot of ways, I spent a lot of my time as a Fulbright Scholar having to go over the exact same issues that One America did in 1997. I end up talking about still in 2016. And it's fascinating in that people who are wanting to hear about the United States are constantly, I had students constantly coming back to this question of why wasn't the United States able, right, to successfully wrestle with this question. And in a lot of ways, it countered the image that the United States constantly puts out there of democracy, and freedom. So it's unclear sort of what the issue is. But for me, Dr. Franklin lays the groundwork in a couple of ways of me having to explain, navigate, and really kind of hold up with a critical eye, right? This whole question of talking about the possibilities of democracy and then at the same time, the realities of it on the ground and the ways in which equity and equality has been out of reach.
And if I could go back to the 60s, I had my first experience of having to explain America and racism when I was 14, living with a French family. And this is how much America is followed abroad. In a French family, at least in the olden days, everyone gathered at 8 o'clock in the evening to have dinner and watch the evening news. And we're sitting there in Compiègne where the World War I armistice is signed. And I look on the television and it's Detroit and Chicago in 1967 on fire. And these are the summer riots across the United States being broadcast on French television. And my French family says, how can this be? They had, in alternate years, an American come and live with them and their 4 children, or a German come and live with them and their 4 children. And they say they don't ever want to go to war with Germany again. That's why they send their children to Germany and they have German children come and live with them. And that's the only way they could understand conflict. And thank goodness I grew up in my household and knew this background and history and had to learn how to say it in French. So that really helped my fluency because I knew the subject. And now I had to explain it to a French family, including their children, what racism was, what the history of slavery was. And my French mother said, Blanche Loison, may she rest in peace. She said, you could marry our daughter. I said, well, that's very nice. I said, what if she married a North African? She said, oh, they're dirty, they're lazy. No, never. I said, that's racism, because she told me there was no racism in France until I said North Africans. And the French had just lost the Algerian War. And her enmity and hostility was toward the Algerians, not toward Black Africans. So that gave me the first inkling of how the world is always watching what happens in the United States, whether it's the 60s and the Civil Rights Movement, whether it's later periods, and now with Black Lives Matter. I spent a lot of time in France, and the French are watching police brutality in the United States and then reading the literature out of the African-American press, out of the African-American experience in translation, because they can identify with these issues here. There's police brutality in France, but we have the similar images of Confederate statues here, but they're colonial images all across Africa. And those statues are replaced by African heroes, the people who are symbolizing slavery and colonialism in Europe, whether it's King Leopold or the people involved in Bristol or Liverpool or London in the slave trade or France in the slave trade. They become then objects of criticism, and their statues are removed by force all this past year. So we failed to realize the impact of what happens in the United States on issues in Europe.
Dr. Franklin, I know that Mr. Franklin, excuse me, I know that your father spent a lot of time working on this kind of reconciliation project, right? As it relates to, thinking about Tulsa, as it relates to just kind of global affairs and the ways in which we can come together. When I hear you speak and I hear Dr. Frazier speak, about these very real issues of kind of race and representation and what it means to be, what it means to represent America abroad, but also be racialized in those same spaces. We have, I know the 3 of us could probably share all kinds of different experiences that we've had where we've had to kind of figure out who we were in that particular space at that time and what we were representing at that time. And so I'm just thinking about in terms of kind of the next slide that we see here coming up, how your father's relationships with these leaders around the world, these attempts to kind of, sit at the table and have these common conversations in order to solve common problems, how do you think that impacted kind of a lot of what we see in terms of the scholarship, but also just diplomatic relations in the US?
Right. Well, the marvelous image you have on the left here is of my father in conversation with Archbishop Tutu. By this point in 98 on the island of Gorée in Senegal, my father has chaired President Clinton's initiative on race, and the Archbishop has chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. They did not know each other. A filmmaker asked me if I thought a conversation between the two of them would be useful. And it was a marvelous 2-week conversation, unscripted and filmed, that appears in a documentary. We saw clips of that. When you saw in the very first clip, palm trees in the background, that was actually on Gorée, and the rest of it was in the United States. But Dad got a chance to talk about his history and his society, and how his society had evolved and had not evolved. And the Archbishop, similarly, though younger than my dad and very deferential to Dad, he was 16 years younger than Dad, talked about South Africa and growing up in South Africa, and growing up under apartheid. He's old enough to have known South Africa before apartheid. Apartheid isn't imposed until 1948. So he's a young man when apartheid is imposed and legalized in South Africa. So they have a marvelous conversation, which we filmed, and then we brought 21 young people, 7 from South Africa, 7 from the US, and 7 Senegalese students hosting them. And each group was very diverse racially, ethnically, and religiously. Our American youth represented the whole gamut, from Haitian immigrants to Asian American, Jewish American, Southern, West Coast, East Coast, Native American. The Senegalese delegation included Muslims and Christians, Africans, French, and Lebanese, which is the mix in Senegal. And then the South Africans represented the different ethnicities: Afrikaner, British, Xhosa, Zulu, so-called colored. So it was an incredible conversation among the 3 groups of young people, and then their interface with Dad and the Archbishop. It's quite an experience. We filmed it over a 2-year period. We filmed in Senegal, in South Africa, and in the US. And then we're able to bring all the young people together for a premiere here in the US. But Dad was very key in helping them understand the United States, the Archbishop helping them understand South Africa. And then Dad continued to travel abroad until 2007. With President's initiative on race, he got a higher level of visibility than he had ever had before. And in 2005, you see him here celebrating his 90th birthday on the island of Hawaii with my wife, Karen, and me right with him. That year, he published 2 brand new books. Now, this gives incentive to all people to know that at 90, you can publish 2 brand new books: Mirror to America, which was his autobiography, and then with one of his other co-authors, Lawrence Schwinniger, they wrote a book called In Search of the Promised Land, which looks at 3 generations of an African-American family from slavery into freedom. It's a marvelous book. I just read it recently, actually. But Dad gets a new level of visibility. Those books are promoted, unlike any of his other books, by the publishers. He's interviewed by Bill Clinton. He's interviewed by Dan Rather. So that's sort of the top of our visibility for publishers, for published authors. And he has not experienced that level of renown and visibility prior to that. It's really quite remarkable to see. And I'm glad he was well enough to enjoy that visibility and prominence in his 90 to 94 years before we lost him in 2009.
Thank you. I'm noticing that we have quite a few questions in the Q&A that I'm going to navigate here in a second. I just want to know, before we move to the Q&A period, do you have any final thoughts, Dr. Frazier or Mr. Franklin, before we kind of exit out of the formal part of the presentation.
Nishani, I'll let you go first.
Okay. Well, I actually wanted to do a couple of reminders. First, I do remember when I was working with Dr. Franklin, he was actually invited to go to Brazil. And one of the things he talked about was his work on the President's Initiative on Race. So I think it's important to understand that even though it's sort of seen as a domestic, right, initiative, people are watching from abroad and they're looking at the possible ways that United States is trying to come at this whole question of dealing with racism and discrimination. But the other thing that I think is just as interesting and perhaps even more interesting is that when you look at the report, it incorporates a conversation about human rights, and in particular mentions the Convention for Eliminating All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And in that, they talk about the ways in which the United States can serve as a diplomatic leader in challenging this issue and problem of racism, and that racism and ethnicism is not just within the United States, it's in these other spaces like Brazil. And by taking that step, it can actually be a global leader in that space. So I think it's interesting that Dr. Franklin sort of always is walking with this sense of a global interaction, global relationship. It's not far from his thinking, even when he's thinking about the ways that the United States can address its own inequities and problems or issues when it comes to racism. But beyond that, it was a wonder and an honor to work with Dr. Franklin. And it was incredible to listen to him talk about his international travel, talk about his research and his work. I was there when he was finishing off his autobiography, and it was an amazing experience. And I carried Dr. Franklin everywhere and at all times.
One of the things I wanted to share, I only brought one show and tell. These are the books that I could find. Here is his selected essays, Race and History, published in 1989. And then here is the Portuguese version, published in Brazil. And that was an occasion for him to return to Brazil in 99 to lecture in Brazilian universities and to talk about Raça e História, his collected essays published in Portuguese. As I said, it's very important for these materials to be accessible to people who do not read English. I hope that Evelyn and I will be able to convince the publisher that it needs to be in Spanish, not just for the United States, but for the hemisphere.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you both. We are going to continue this conversation, continue the discussion. The questions range from questions about African American history to more specific questions about Dr. Franklin's life. So I will begin. The first question: is it time to seriously consider reparations for the African American community? And we'll just stop. There's more, but we'll stop there. So is it time to seriously consider reparations for the African American community?
Well, my father said, one, that he considered himself to be a runaway slave, and that reparations were needed for all of the things that African Americans have been denied in this society, denied access to education. Most professions were blocked for participation by African Americans. The unions blocked African American membership. And so it's an issue of access. And he felt that the access could be compensated, the denial of access could be compensated through scholarships and fellowships. He felt that was a means to make amends. Georgetown University, for example, sold its 272 enslaved members to an Episcopalian who becomes governor of Louisiana. Georgetown has contacted the descendants of the people they sold and offered them some kind of access to Georgetown University. And the last program I held at the National Museum on Emancipation Day, DC Compensated Emancipation Day, was for Georgetown Vice President, representative of the Society of Jesus, and descendants of the enslaved from Georgetown and the enslaved from Monticello to speak in 2019 about the importance of gaining access to these institutions. I reminded an audience last week that the American Medical Association denied African American doctors access. The American Bar Association denied African Americans access. The American Dental Association denied African American dentists access to these professional organizations until the late 60s and 70s, so that we developed a parallel set of African American institutions for our professionals: the National Bar Association, the National Medical Association, the National Dental Association, and then these parallel organizations of historians, of engineers, of all kinds of professions, because we have been denied access to the broader field. So my father said that reparations can be in the form of improved access and scholarship, and I go along with his analysis.
And I really want to add to that, and it'll be short and sweet. One of the things that I thought was interesting about Ta-Nehisi Coates when he does his piece is that he moves the conversation of reparations away from slavery and into this whole question of discrimination, racial discrimination that took place around housing. But Dr. Franklin talked about this for a long time before that piece comes out. And what he says is that when we talk about all the ways in which the Black community has been denied, there's a whole bunch that comes after slavery that has inhibited and hindered Black folks' development economically, socially, and politically. And so the conversation of reparations is a lot more nuanced and a lot more greater in terms of chronology and issues to address than just to situate it within the context of slavery.
If you read books like Slavery by Another Name, that looks at the post-Civil War to World War II period, any white sheriff could stop any Black woman, man, or child in the street, accuse them of a fictional crime, arrest them, have them sentenced, and then sell them to cotton plantations, sugar plantations, coal mines, until World War II. The Attorney General of the United States goes to the South in 1905 and 1906 to investigate this re-enslavement, and no white male jury will convict other white males of enslaving African Americans. And at most, they got a $100 fine and then continued their work. You look at Isabel Wilkerson's work on how brutal conditions were throughout much of the 20th century for African Americans of the South. And she talks about their migrations are not the migrations of people just simply looking for a better life. They're the migrations, they define migration theory, they're like people fleeing famine and war. And then you look at a book like The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And Richard Rothstein was doing a research on schools and why schools were different in the Black community and white communities, and then realized it's all around housing. And so his book is called The Color of Law: How the United States Government Segregated America. And so all these laws that create ghettos and segregation, and now projects that were built for whites now being housing Blacks, are all part of government policies that he analyzes right up until the present.
Thank you. This next question is a bit of an academic question. Dr. Frazier, I think I'll kick it to you. In it says basically that it's often very difficult to encourage passionate and intellectually talented Black students to choose the path of history. What can we do to strengthen that pipeline?
So one of the things that and I would say this not just about history, but humanities in general, is that we're in this period where things like STEM and technology are held up above humanities. And there's this question of how can you get a job? But they don't ask the question, how can you change the world? And how can we change human society? And I think humanities raises those questions in uncomfortable ways when we start to talk about how technology operates with surveillance and AI, or even how corporations operate in terms of exploitation and capitalism. So in a lot of ways, history provides, and we can talk to students about the ways in which history provides insight, right, into the problems of this approach in operating in terms of American society. We have only to look at history to understand why wealth inequality is a problem. It's the foundation of the Great Depression, beginning in the 1920s, when you have these exorbitant and huge distinctions between people who are the CEOs and the business owners and the average working people. It's not sustainable. Now, when it comes to Black history in particular, and this is something I deal with and talk about all the time, again, there's this sort of fundamental question of what can you do with Black history? And I tell my students all the time, there's never a space or place where Black history is not in operation and in action. When we look at health inequality, one of the issues that they deal with in right now with COVID has to do with Black people's response to the vaccination, Black people's response to medical efforts to get them to participate or volunteer in any kind of vaccination studies. That has to do with the way in which Black people have experienced the medical field, dating back from moments of slavery, going all the way up the present. And so there is no leaving Black history behind. People want to look at health inequality and then just sort of like magically solve the problem. If you can just tell Black people to go get a vaccine and explain it to them, that'll solve the problem. No, it won't. And you have to have Black history in your arsenal so that when you're in the nursing space and the medical field, you can give people a clear and full understanding about why the approach doesn't work in the ways that they need to change. And there's no time that Black history doesn't have an application, whether it's health inequality, whether it's film and filmmaking. You know, if you give me a field, I will tell you how Black history is in play. And I think we have to make that case. But more importantly, I think Black history has operated really strongly to connect humanities with real life. Right? We have to stop with the sort of academic ivory tower talk to each other. I say that I'm a historian of the people, partly because I don't spend my time talking to historians, right? I talk to folks. And that means that we have to do better at demonstrating how history can impact our everyday life. Black studies shows us that. And in fact, his whole ideal, his mission is built around the connection between information and data and intellectual exercise with everyday folks and how we can transform their lives. So I think we make the case for how the two are connected and move from there.
I spoke to a group of mid-level professionals. They're young professionals aspiring to greater heights. And I began with the discussion of the African diaspora and the map showing all the places that we're sent. And the first question was, why didn't I know this before now? And these are people in their 30s and 40s. And they've not had the opportunity to learn about history that involves them. Black history is put aside as a separate subject and not incorporated into American history and world history. If it were more inclusive, then people might be able to see themselves in it. And I talked today about America's history of immigration control. when we closed the borders in 1882 to China, when we reopened immigration beyond Europe to Africa, the Caribbean, South America, is post-1965. And so people need to understand our own diplomatic history to understand the flows of immigration into the United States. And the other question was about how do we inspire young people to be interested in this? And I said, well, in the museum world, we try to encourage young people to learn how to interview their family members first, to realize that we as adults are repositories of knowledge. And then once they have those skills, they can interview their relatives and their neighbors and even strangers and learn that history is made up of stories of people's lives. It's not just the stories of the powerful, the rich, and the famous, which our society unfortunately highlights beyond what is necessary. My father said that everyone has a book in them and everyone has a story worth telling. One of our colleagues, and I don't need to mention her by name, focused on interviewing Black women domestics and learning about their lives and the challenges they face. And this is part of a whole shift of history from being about the rich and powerful only worldwide to social and cultural history that looks at women, that looks at everyday people. I'll never forget the Association for the Study of African American Life and History meeting in Atlanta, where a group of Black women historians got together, and they already had their PhDs and then done their PhDs on, interesting topics, but they had never considered studying Black women as a subject. And they said, now, Booker T. Washington had a wife. What was her name? Where are her papers? Carter G. Woodson. Where are the women around them? What are their stories? And they've now formed an organization of Black women historians just to begin, and this is in the last 30 years, to begin to explore the lives of Black women in the past. Favolia Glimp has done a book on African-American women in the Civil War. No one had done that. So there's material that has not been explored. When I was talking to people at Georgetown about doing this program, Georgetown said, we have boxes of archives from the 1820s and 1830s we haven't opened yet. So there's material that needs to be done. What we have to do is cultivate the curiosity of young people of what is not yet known. What do you want to find out? How can you make a difference? And you have to inspire them to become engaged in this work, and then they'll find the passion.
Right, exactly. I think this next question is actually you actually provide a nice segue rather into this next question, and that is, can you say something about the role of women as lead U.S. representatives during the time of Dr. Franklin's experiences?
Can you say that again?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you speak about women as lead U.S. representatives during the time that Dr. Franklin was also representing the U.S. internationally?
Well, the very first State Department employee I met was an African-American woman in Casablanca, who was the branch cultural attaché. And so I realized that women represented the United States and Black women represented the United States. You have African-American women entering and being nurtured by other older generations of African-American women in the State Department. I saw that sequence of seniority when I lived in Senegal and met women who come into the State Department who were far along in their careers and reached the highest levels within state of ambassadorships and assistant secretary positions. The woman who introduced me this morning became our assistant secretary of state for African affairs. So you see that progression of African-American women, I assume it's white and other women as well, from the 60s to the present.
Dr. Frazier?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of things. So there are formal and then informal ways that Black women are representing the United States, not all of which the United States would particularly prefer. We have people like Zelma George, who is an African-American woman in Cleveland, Ohio. She's, around this time, she's connected in working with the United Nations. We also have people like Claudia Jones in the 1940s, 1950s. She is a part of the Communist Party. She's connecting internationally with other Communist Party members, challenging this issue of racial inequality. And this is what I mean by some of it is not exactly the way the United States would like to see Black women representing the nation state, but this is part of the reality of the United States. And then, of course, you have Black people traveling internationally. You have Shirley Graham Du Bois, who is one of the people who's also socialist, and she's traveling. Paul Robeson's wife, she has an international standing. There's another. Yes, Islanda. I was like, how can I forget Islanda's name? Because the name is so fantastic. And these are women who have a very global view of equality. They contextualize the Black experience within a larger context of movements for freedom. By the time the 1960s come along, Black women who are in the freedom movement are front and center in terms of this international presentation and perspective. And they're also the ones who are raising questions about United States policy on issues like Vietnam, which was also so very interesting because Dr. Franklin is in Fulbright at the time of the Vietnam War. And so there's this tension between the representation that the United States would like to have through diplomacy and Fulbright, and then the build up of the Vietnam War. So Black women are playing multiple dynamic roles, not all of it just within sort of diplomatic spaces.
So as I've been looking through my family papers preparing for tonight, I found 2 cards from Lois Malo Jones from Haiti. The cards come from Haiti, the very famous African-American author. And I mentioned Islanda because when we were sorting through my father's books, my father had 6,000 books we had to go through. And my wife and I were first selecting the ones we wanted to keep before we offered Duke the books that they did not have in their library. And Duke did not have 2,000 of the books in my father's library were not in Duke's library. So that tells you what an incredible collection he had. But I reached up on the shelf and I saw Here I Stand by Paul Robeson. And as I pulled it off the shelf, notes from Islanda and Paul fell out of the book. And I came across the book again this week, and they're the notes from Paul and Islanda. And another dear family friend, Mabel Smythe, becomes Assistant Secretary of State for Africa during my father's lifetime, after she and her husband had both been ambassadors, and she had been Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. So it's been fascinating to see the rise of Black women in the international sphere.
Wow, I'm still stuck on the letters that are coming out, the notes that are coming out of the book. I'm excited.
I know, right?
I found letters, not this time, but while I was going through my father's papers, I found letters from Eleanor Roosevelt, County Cullen, Du Bois. You know, growing up in that household, you didn't know who might be on the phone. It could be Thurgood Marshall, could be, anyone.
This next question is kind of a larger general question about support. So kind of going back to this issue of support and the pipeline. How do you think the Fulbright program can better support and create space for grantees to talk about the complexities of representing America and talk about these aspects related to American history and contemporary society when they are undertaking these grants overseas, like, of course, your father did, as you have, Dr. Frazier, I have, right? So what are some ways that the spaces can be opened up, and maybe what people like to call difficult conversations can take place in terms of these complexities?
Well, I'm going to defer the Fulbright approach to the two of you, but as a Smithsonian person, I've been asked by our embassies in different parts of the world to talk about the United States from my vantage point. Our embassy in Paris asked me to do a series of conversations with French museum colleagues on difficult subjects such as racism, war, anti-Semitism, colonialism, and slavery. And so they gathered museum directors and curators from across France to meet with me, an initial meeting. And I said, this needs to be a much deeper and longer several-day conversation, and I will return to France to do that, and I must visit your respective institutions before we have the second round of conversations. And so it's not Fulbright, but it's the embassy that facilitated that conversation between an American working in museums and his counterparts, my counterparts, in French institutions. And that has created a series of long-term relationships between the Smithsonian and these museums in France. And so that's an example of how, as an individual from a quasi-federal agency, I could have influence on discussions in France. I did the same thing in Brazil. I've done the same thing in other countries. But Fulbrighters, Nishani and Kalenda, can you respond to that question, please?
Kalenda, I want you to respond first. I'm just curious about your response, and then I'm happy to chime in.
I'm the moderator, Dr. Frazier. So I would say that there are a lot of opportunities that can take place, even just by connecting Fulbrighters of color to each other. And I know that there are currently kind of these digital spaces and various different groups that have been kind of like community groups that have been formed. But I just know in my experience, even though I had traveled abroad several times, I had not really been in contact with anyone who would have the same sort of face the same sort of challenges that I would face, kind of representing, right, the nation in a time of intense political turmoil, and also being an African American woman. And so I emailed people and tried to reach out and find out, you know, who had recently gone abroad, who might have been in the same, you know, field or what have you. And the numbers weren't as large as I thought they would be. And so that network wasn't as large as I guess I thought it should have been, or it could have been. And so a lot of my experience was just kind of trial by fire. And so I think to the question, one of the ways in which these conversations can take place ahead of time, people can be kind of prepared, especially for those who haven't traveled, you know, abroad and or had to go represent, right, another country. One of the ways that those conversations can be useful and take place is if there were networks, if there were sponsored networks of scholars of color who could work together, talk together, share experiences in organic ways, either prior to or even after coming back from their stay abroad.
So I'm going to chime in after Kalenda. I think that is absolutely on point. I would probably say that given Kalenda and I's sort of style, we probably bogarted the situation a lot more than people might feel inclined to do, in that asserting yourself was sort of one of those realities in having to navigate certain kinds of spaces. And I was in Norway. In the many years that Norway had been in operation, we could count on a hand, and that's probably too many fingers, how many Black people had been there as a fellow. And what they quickly learned from me was that my experience as a teacher was not the experience of previous Fulbrights or even Fulbrights who were my current colleague. A lot of them sort of had pictured themselves, right, as bastions of reprieve from the suppression, oppression of the United States, and had not quite grappled with the ways in which racism was internal to the spaces where they were in operation. And Norway, of course, was struggling with both white nationalism, with immigration from East Africa and from Syria. And they were sort of locked into this notion that there was not a problem of racism and inequality, although police brutality had begun to emerge as an issue, although people of color seemed to be only in certain schools that I ended up teaching at. So you saw that sort of indirect segregation taking place. And as a result, my experience reflected both the animus that was underlying, right, the processes that had led to segregation, and at the same time, a kind of, shall we say, a sort of rosy-colored sense of self. I spent some time, and I was lucky because I had a group of people who were cognizant, they were aware, and who I could speak to about what it meant for me to teach in these kinds of spaces, because I had a couple of circumstances where students were incredibly aggressive. I mean, when I say aggressive, I was cursed out, and other kinds of behaviors exhibited. And so they were kind of forced to kind of have these conversations in ways that they had not been before. And I think that's the key here, along with connecting people of color and creating a kind of network as a kind of support system and preparatory process. All of the Fulbright offices have got to be open to the reality that people of color and that women may be having a different experience than what they presume that experience should be, and then help them and be open to facilitating a process by which they can better navigate these spaces and how to respond in these kinds of spaces. But it has to first begin with a sort of confrontation about the ways in which racism is in some of these spaces.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful, I think, and very wide-ranging conversation. We have time for one more question, and I know there's several over in the Q&A. And so the last question is, Dr. Franklin famously presided over President Clinton's initiative on race, which we know, we saw images. Do you think it is necessary to create a Race and Reconciliation Commission in America, much like South Africa did after apartheid? And of course, knowing that there were attempts for participation in the Durban, right, gathering. But what are your thoughts about that? Mr. Franklin, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that we need a new conversation that will be much more complex and address the true complexities of our society, with the understanding that every country in the hemisphere had slavery, and therefore every country sending people to the United States come with legacies of racial hierarchies, and that has to be dealt with. So people come with prejudices, people come with attitudes, and I don't think the country has been willing to analyze those. Let me give you an example. We left behind Eurasian and Afro-Asian children in Vietnam. The Afro-Asian orphans were kept in the back room in the dark, and the Vietnamese were only offering up the Eurasian children for adoption. So these are attitudes that are prevalent worldwide, and we as a society need to recognize.
Thank you. Dr. Frazier, do you have any last thing, or you want me to kick it over back to Madeline?
I'm just going to hold this up and say, read the book. We did this in 1997, and there are a whole list of prescriptions and recommendations. And I pulled it out and reread them again, and I was amazed at the ways in which it's speaking to the future about some of the ways we can address issues of racial inequality, and repeating the kind of things that you hear now. And to John Franklin's point, globalizing it, which the book talks about, right? But only in a small level. But I think John Franklin has really brought home the ways in which we need to think about even talking about conversations about reparations in a global perspective. Right? The slaves or the enslaved people are responsible for the global economy, not just the United States. The Industrial Revolution stands on the back of cotton and cotton production. And that's what makes England a powerhouse. So we need to sort of contextualize this in a larger conversation about racial inequity in order to really situate what is happening in the United States in its proper light.
Thank you. Thank you both. Madeline, please take it away.
Great. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our wonderful panelists and moderator for making this evening happen tonight. And thank you to you all in our audience for joining. We're so happy to have you here with us today as we learned more about Fulbright alumnus, historian, activist, and educator, Dr. John Hope Franklin. So we hope to see you at some of our upcoming 75th anniversary events. Notably, there's one coming up next Thursday, which I'm chatting out the link to for registration. We will be hosting another 75th event, which will feature a conversation with Fulbright alumnus and Pulitzer Prize winning author Jeffrey Stewart, which you can register through the link that I just chatted out. So we hope you all have a lovely weekend. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you at our next event. Thank you.